So welcome. The average age of a company listed on the Standard & Poor's 500 index has fallen from almost 60 years in the 1950s to less than 20 years today. And in the next decade, we expect to see that reduce even further to, say, 10 years. What that translates into is that 50% of the S&P index will be replaced in the next decade. So the pressure to survive is greater than ever before. Now, these are some of the most admired and desirable brands in their time. They had the best people, the best technology, they're the most successful firms. Hopefully you'll recognize some of them. When large companies typically find this success, they get comfortable with doing the thing that got them there in the first place. They stick to a formula that's worked for them, that helped them get to where they are. That's when they fall into the trap of becoming repetitive, slow, and unresponsive. So what worked well yesterday surely must work well tomorrow, right? So what do you think happened to some of these companies? Well, it turns out these companies either went into bankruptcy, got acquired, or died a slow and painful death, which is always sad to see for some of the most well-known and loved brands out there. They couldn't or wouldn't reinvent themselves. How many of you in this room can actually relate to that in the companies that you either work for or that you have worked for in the past? Companies that are unwilling to reinvent themselves risk being irrelevant. Companies unwilling to take a risk to place those big bets are at a higher risk of failure than those that are. One of the most notable examples of companies learning from this lesson can be found in Facebook. Mark is probably more fearful of a missed opportunity than he is of an experiment or something that he's tried that's actually failed and not worked out. What he does, he benchmarks ideas that are proposed to him, his own ideas, in terms of whether it'll actually destroy the company. So it's quite a high benchmark for a company the size of Facebook. If there's no risk of actually destroying a firm, then what's the harm in actually giving an idea a go and trying it out? Now, Facebook, of course, has big problems. It's got big challenges that it faces today, big challenges it's going to face tomorrow. But that's what you'd expect for a company that deals with 2 billion customers every month. But if Facebook sticks to the principle of continuing to take risks, continue to experiment and trial new ideas, I'm actually quite comfortable and confident that Mark's company is not going to be one of those companies that disappears and fades away. Now, the Microsoft that I grew up with in the 90s was hugely successful in selling Windows and Office, products that you're probably familiar with. These are their cash cows that made them a lot of money, made them very successful. But of course, the pattern again is finding that early success, repeating it, committing to those same products, and sticking with that same thing. But then disruption comes along. And what Microsoft did was it responded to disruption in the same way that Kodak, BlackBerry, Blockbuster did. It didn't respond. It actually doubled down on the things that made it successful in the first place. And that's the typical trap and the typical problem that large corporates face. They're not willing to extend beyond their comfort zone. And you can start to see how this was starting to erode their business over time. But something changed, and I think for the better. The Microsoft of today looks very different to the one I grew up with. Still, of course, makes a lot of money for its Windows and Office products, but it's also finding a lot of success in other areas. It's got cloud offering, which is competing with the likes of Google's cloud platform, Amazon's web services, something that was perhaps unheard of a few years ago. It's investing in mixed reality devices with HoloLens, not necessarily market-creating products, not exactly successful yet, but they are trying ideas, they're experimenting, and they are taking those risks. They have apps for iOS and Android. 10 years ago, I would never see that being a possibility. Even Visual Studio, for the developers of you in this room, is available on the Mac today. Again, something that would be unheard of 10 years ago, certainly when I was growing up with Microsoft products. These are all symptomatic of a company that is willing to disrupt itself in order to reinvent itself. So again, Microsoft, for all its failings, for all its problems that it has, I'm actually quite confident that it will succeed and continue to reinvent itself. Now, we're seeing companies that recognize the lessons in the past So they are learning from past mistakes. They are exploring ideas. They're taking risks and reaching out beyond their comfort zones. And it's these companies that will become the future case studies of how the top companies not only survived disruption, but they actually thrived. Now, hopefully some of the examples that are playing behind me on the screen here are familiar to some of you. Some of them were spectacular failures, Google Glass, for instance. But the point that Mark was trying to make with Facebook is that it's what you learn through the process of going through product developments and trialing new ideas and going through experiments. That in itself holds a great deal of value to firms, and the companies that recognize that will succeed. I don't know if any of you have seen this, but it's quite fascinating what companies like this robotics firm, which used to be owned by Google, is doing. But taking on experiments like this, as long as they don't break your business, as Mark was saying, they are worthwhile trying out. Now, last year on this very same stage, I said that the UX field has a responsibility for ensuring it participates in the development of new and emerging technologies. The scope of what UX is and where it applies is changing all the time. The pace is quite unforgiving as we see new platforms emerge every day. This is Tesla's autopilot feature in action, and I bet the designers who are responsible for this never even imagined that they would be working on projects like this. How many of you are going to be working on systems like this, where there's little point of reference to compare with? It's exciting, exhilarating to think about the opportunities we'll be working with and the types of technologies that don't quite exist yet. How will the UX discipline evolve and adapt to the constant invention of new form factors?
Alexa, call Ashley.
Yeah, it's about time you called that girl.
No, he just talked to that girl 2 hours ago. You gotta let love marinate. Put love in that bag to marinate.
Love gonna be in that bag like, I can't wait to talk to him tomorrow.
What? And then after it marinates,
No.
you're gonna pull it out.
JB, who's Alexa? Say it, JB.
You Alexa.
That's right, I'm Alexa.
Thanks, guys, but I'll take it from here.
So what about the devices that don't even have a UI? A lot of you, your friends, your families will have unboxed Amazon Echo or a Google Home device this last Christmas. Maybe some of you lucky ones have unboxed a HomePod recently in the last couple of weeks. Technology is becoming mainstream. So how many of you in this room consider yourselves experts or experienced in developing for non-UI devices? UX is critical to disruptive technologies. And I think that's why it's important for you as designers to learn, adapt, and be ready for what is considered the new normal.
You'll get used to it. Was that funny?
Yeah.
Oh, good, I'm funny. Okay, let's start with your emails. You have several thousand emails regarding LA Weekly, but it looks like you haven't worked there in many years.
Oh, yeah. I think I was just saving those because I thought maybe I wrote something funny in some of them.
Yeah, there are some funny ones. I'd say there are about 86 that we should save. We can delete the rest.
Okay.
Okay? Can we move forward?
Yeah, let's do that.
Okay. So before we address your organizational methods, I'd like to sort through your contacts. Oh, you have a lot of contacts.
I'm very popular.
Really? Does this mean you actually have friends?
So the new normal looks like it will take the form of digital personal assistants. They're voice-enabled, they're capable of processing natural language, and they're able to interrogate and understand lots of data. These technologies are becoming increasingly sophisticated, but the magic behind these technologies isn't in the AI, isn't in the machine learning. It's in the user experience of those products and those technologies. Those concepts come to life, are brought to life by the people in this room, not the technologies. The technologies are enablers. So it's really important to recognize that. Those moments of magic where the response you see are the moments that you have, that you hear delight you, and equally when it doesn't quite meet expectations. That again sits squarely at the door of UX. So this is a DeepMind experiment called WaveNet. It's a company that Google acquired in the last couple of years. I'm just going to play an audio clip from this. Now what you heard there, let me just play that once more. Most of the voice-enabled systems you hear are generated from short recordings of audio clips from someone actually, a voice actor, actually being recorded and capturing those snippets of audio. And what systems like Alexa, Siri, what they do is they piece together those snippets to create words. Now, Google is taking a slightly different approach. What DeepMind's doing is modeling what the audio waveform looks like and how it behaves, and actually using that model to generate natural-sounding speech. So no voice actors involved.
The avocado is a pear-shaped fruit with leathery skin, smooth edible flesh, and a large stone.
And just by using those algorithms, they're able to generate natural-sounding voice, which is much more scalable, much more adaptable to differing situations, as opposed to locking a voice actor in a recording studio and capturing all those snippets of audio.
Can a robot write a symphony? Can a robot turn a canvas into a beautiful masterpiece?
Can you?
And of course, if you can understand the waveform for human speech, you can understand the waveform for any type of audio, including music. So that audio clip that you heard there is again another clip that's generated using the same algorithms that drove the voice that you heard earlier. So it turns out robots can write symphonies after all. Now on the spectrum of useful startups, at one end and aging enterprises in the other, the company I work for at LexisNexis sits closer to the latter. By any measure, we're a really old firm, been around for over 200 years. The Tully business is the tax and accounting business of LexisNexis, and that's over 100 years old. So it's not difficult to imagine that a company like this, a brand like this, has faced disruption over its lifespan. And that work very much continues today, from printing books when we started, to printing CDs containing books, to publishing those books online. That's been kind of our journey over the last 100 years. Now, part of my job is to figure out where the next disruption is going to come from, and if possible, to try and get ahead of it. But the funny thing about disruption is that, of course, you don't know it's happened until it's too late. So this is a clip of a typical journey that a user goes through when they're using our current product. Let me just play that for you. So they use search. In this case, they're looking for the personal allowance for 2017. You get a set of search results. User tries to look for the answer in the summarized results, but isn't able to find it. So they click through to the page and start scanning for the answer in the text. Of course, in dissecting all that text, scanning through it, user can't find it, so they start to use the find feature in the browser to look for keywords that are relevant to 2017 in this instance. They struggle to find it, not able to necessarily get to the answer that they're looking for. Let's compare that to a user journey with our experiment that we're running.
What was the personal allowance in 2017?
The personal allowance for income tax in the 2017/2018 tax year is £11,500.
What will the personal allowance be for the next tax year?
The personal allowance for income tax in the 2018/2019 tax year will be £11,850.
What was the retail price index value in March 2002?
The retail price index for March 2002 was 174.5.
Okay, what was the retail price index value from 6 months ago?
The retail price index for August 2017 was 274.7.
So Tully AI is our experiment in providing more direct answers to tax professionals' questions. We've trained it to answer questions based on various tax rates, provide definitions and guidance on various tax scenarios, as well as perform calculations. Now, thankfully, this video is an experiment of our own, rather than a startup or a competitor. But you can start to see how these new and emerging technologies can be disruptive to a business that's so well established, so comfortable in what it does, and so successful at what it does. And that's why we pursued this idea, very much born out of that thinking, that mindset of where the next disruption is going to come from, and how that might impact a successful and what might be considered an untouchable business. So how do we go about doing this? Well, an idea can start as a sketch, it can start as a wireframe, it can start as a line of code. It doesn't really matter. There's no set way or process to actually start. Very much depends on what it is that you're trying to do, who you're working with, and the people involved. But the key thing to remember is that just make a start. I started working on that prototype as an experiment in exploring natural language processing technologies. We didn't know where it was going to lead us. We wanted to understand whether it could pick up entities in a tax situation, tax terms, train an AI engine to recognize those specific values. It wasn't pretty. It didn't understand a lot when we started with it. But it was a step, if only a small one, in figuring out what it is that we needed to do and where we need to take things next. So MVP is critical, and hopefully many of you will be familiar with this diagram. In this example, we are taking two different paths to building a car. The top path might be the traditional corporate route, gold-plated design, all the features, all the bells, polished, ready for market, ready for glamour. The bottom row is more similar to how a startup might approach developing a product or an idea or a concept. And we as a large corporate are trying to adopt these principles at the core of our product development process. The difference between the two is, for me as a product manager, is that you're delivering value at each stage. The top row, you're starting to componentize what makes up a car, but not necessarily seeing or delivering any value until you reach the end. And that's only if you reach the end of your final goal. Now, being disruptive in an undisruptable environment takes courage. You're going to have to take a few punches to the face a few times and the gut along the way. Get comfortable with being uncomfortable, because being disruptive is never going to be an easy ride. By its very nature, it will upset a few people. There is no set template or process, as I was saying. And there will be little or no guidance with where you might take an idea. And at times, self-doubt will creep in, but stay committed to your idea and be willing to see it through. Now, fearing failure is a natural instinct that we all have, which tells us when things aren't right. Even though the Silicon Valley mantra is to fail fast and fail often, I'm sure you've all heard that before, and that you shouldn't be fearful of failure. I actually think fearing failure can be a good thing in the correct dosage, when applied with the correct dosage. It's important to recognize a bit of fear in what you do. It will help you instinctively tell you where you should be willing to push a little bit further and where you should be holding back. It's a careful balancing act, as with anything. One of the reasons why successful companies get disruptive is because they can't step out of their own comfort zone, as we mentioned before. It's a very difficult thing to do, though. It's a bit like how you don't realize how you sound until you hear it played back on a recording. So try and put a lens on your business, on your product, on your teams that steps outside of your immediate workspace. Give yourself that external view, and from there you might spot an opportunity to disrupt, because if you aren't doing that, then your competitors certainly will be. This has been Disrupting the Undisruptable. Thank you very much.